Marcus Holley was not a man who made mistakes twice. He had built his company from nothing, from a one-bedroom apartment with a broken heater and a laptop that overheated if you ran more than 2 programs at once. And somewhere along the way, he had learned that the world was full of people who smiled at your face and stole from your back. It had happened more than once. The first time, it was a business partner he had known since college, a man he had trusted with half his company, who quietly moved assets into a shell account over 18 months before disappearing to Portugal. The second time, it was someone closer, someone he had shared a life with, who handed confidential merger documents to a competitor in exchange for a payout that was, in the end, less than what she could have simply asked for. After that, something in him closed. Not dramatically, not all at once, but slowly, the way a window fogs over in the cold, and one day you realize you can't see clearly through it anymore. His estate in the hills outside the city was beautiful by any standard. 12 rooms, floor-to-ceiling glass. A garden that a professional team maintained twice a week, but it felt less like a home and more like a place he happened to sleep. The staff who worked there were professional, polite, and carefully vetted. Background checks, reference calls, social media reviews. He didn't apologize for it. He called it due diligence. His head of security, a quiet and steady man who had worked for him for over a decade, had long stopped questioning the process. That was just how things were done in this house. Every 6 months, without exception, the household staff rotated out. New faces, new contracts, new checks. It kept things clean, he told himself. It kept things safe. And yet, despite all of it, despite the cameras in the hallways and the signed confidentiality agreements and the digital entry logs that recorded every door that opened and closed, he could not stop the low, persistent hum of unease that had been sitting in his chest for the past 3 weeks. It had started the day the new housekeeper arrived. She was referred through a staffing agency his team had used for years, one with an excellent record. Her file was clean. Her references were strong. She had worked in 2 previous households, both well-regarded families, and both had spoken highly of her, thorough, reliable, discreet. She was a woman in her late 40s, originally from West Africa, with close-cropped natural hair and a way of moving through a room that was so quiet and self-contained that you sometimes forgot she was there at all. She did her work without complaint and without conversation. She didn't linger. She didn't ask questions. She made no effort to charm anyone or make herself memorable, which, in his experience, was either a sign of deep professionalism or a sign that someone was being very careful. He couldn't decide which. The thing that bothered him, and he knew rationally that it was a small thing, was the Thursday routine. Every Thursday, like clockwork, she left 17 minutes before his scheduled end time. Not 20 minutes. Not 15. 17. He had noticed it first on the security log, which tracked the time the side staff entrance opened and closed. He assumed it was a clerical issue the first week. The second week, he checked again. Same thing. Third week, same. He mentioned it, almost casually, to his head of security, who looked into it and came back with nothing alarming. The agency confirmed her hours were logged correctly. She wasn't being paid for the extra 17 minutes. She wasn't sneaking out with anything. The cameras showed her leaving with the same small canvas bag she always carried. Nothing unusual, nothing oversized. There was no reason to be suspicious. He knew that. And still he couldn't let it go. It wasn't even really about the time. It was something harder to name. The way she never seemed curious about anything in the house. Never glanced at the artwork, or the view, or the things that made every other new staff member pause, even briefly, in quiet admiration. She kept her eyes on her work, always, as though nothing else existed. Most people, when they first came to work in a house like his, had a period of adjustment. Small reactions they couldn't help. A widened eye at the size of the kitchen. A moment of hesitation in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the valley. She had none of that. It was as if she had already made peace with the world she was walking into before she ever arrived. And that bothered him in a way he couldn't fully explain even to himself. He told himself he was being paranoid. He had a good therapist who had told him more than once that hypervigilance was a trauma response, that his brain had learned to treat stillness as suspicious because stillness had preceded every bad thing that ever happened to him. He understood that intellectually. He believed it, even. But understanding something and feeling it differently are two separate things. And on the fourth Thursday, when the security log once again showed that side door opening and closing at the same 17-minute early mark, he did not call his therapist, and he did not review the camera footage, and he did not ask his head of security to dig deeper. Instead, he picked up his jacket from the back of his chair, told his driver to pull the car around to the east gate, and he went downstairs. He wasn't entirely sure what he expected to find. Some part of him, the rational part, was already composing the quiet apology he would owe her when this turned out to be nothing. When it turned out she had a bus to catch, or a child to pick up, or any one of the 100 ordinary reasons a person might leave work a few minutes early every single week. But the other part of him, the part that had been burned, the part that had learned the hard way that your gut is sometimes the only alarm system that actually works, that part was already out the door. The evening was gray and damp. The kind of autumn drizzle that isn't heavy enough to justify an umbrella, but still manages to get into everything. He spotted her half a block ahead, walking at an even pace, the canvas bag over one shoulder. No phone in her hand, no earbuds in, just walking. She didn't look back. She never looked back. That, too, he noted. At the bus stop on the corner, she stood for 4 minutes before the bus arrived. He watched from the car as she boarded without rushing, without looking around, and took a seat by the window. His driver followed the bus at a careful distance, through the downtown corridor and out the other side, past the neighborhoods that thinned out and changed, past the newer developments and the older ones, until the bus stopped on a street he didn't recognize, lined with corner stores and a laundromat and a church with a hand-painted sign out front. She stepped off the bus. She didn't pause. She walked half a block and turned toward a low, flat building set slightly back from the road, cinder block walls, a parking lot with 2 cracked lines painted across it, and a sign above the entrance that someone had made by hand. The letters slightly uneven, that read, New Roots Community Center. He sat in the car for a moment after the car stopped. His head of security said nothing, which was its own kind of comment. The lights inside the building were on. Through the narrow windows along the front wall, he could see movement. People, quite a few of them, moving around inside with the comfortable rhythm of people who knew exactly where they were going. He could hear, faintly, through the closed car window, the sound of children. He got out of the car. The cold hit him the moment he stepped out of the car. That particular kind of damp evening cold that settles into your collar and doesn't leave. And he stood on the pavement for a second longer than he meant to, looking at the building in front of him with the kind of feeling you get when you've been so certain about something and then suddenly, standing right in front of the truth of it, you're not certain about anything at all. The sign above the door was handmade, as he had noticed from the car, but up close he could see it had been painted carefully. Each letter done with attention, even if not with perfect skill. The kind of thing someone made because they wanted it to look right, even if they didn't have the tools to make it perfect. He pushed the door open. The warmth came first, a wave of it, the kind that comes from a room full of people and something cooking on a stove. And then the smell, something with tomatoes and spice, and a deep, slow-cooked richness that reminded him, in a way that caught him off guard, of a kitchen from his childhood that he hadn't thought about in years. The main hall was larger than it looked from the outside. Rows of long folding tables were set up across the floor, most of them already filled with people, families, elderly men and women, young mothers with small children climbing on and off their laps, teenagers sitting together in that particular teenage way of pretending they don't care where they are while clearly being completely comfortable. There was noise everywhere, not chaotic noise, but the full layered noise of a place where people feel at ease. Conversations overlapping, a child laughing somewhere near the back, the clatter of serving spoons against metal trays, and underneath all of it, from a room to the left, the sound of someone playing a piano, slowly and imperfectly but with great feeling, working through a melody he almost recognized. He stood just inside the doorway, and nobody paid him any attention, which surprised him because he was used to being noticed. In most rooms he walked into, something shifted when he arrived. Not always, obviously, but there was always a small change in the air, a subtle reorientation, the way a room adjusts when someone of a certain weight enters it. Here, nothing shifted. He was just a man standing near a door, and the room continued entirely without him. He looked for her and found her almost immediately, not because she stood out, but because he had spent weeks studying the way she moved through rooms. And that quiet, purposeful way of hers was impossible to miss once you knew it. She had already tied an apron around her waist, a plain blue one that looked like it belonged to the place, not something she had brought, and she was standing at one of the serving tables, talking to an older woman with gray braids and a wide, easy smile, and the thing that stopped him was not what she was doing, but the expression on her face, because it was an expression he had never once seen her wear inside his house. She was laughing, not politely, not the small, careful kind of laugh people use when they're being professional and measured, but a real laugh, the kind that changes your whole face, that makes you tip your head back slightly and forget for a moment that you were trying to look composed. He had worked with her for 3 weeks, and he had not seen her smile like that once. Not even close. A young man who worked at the center, barely out of his teens, wearing a t-shirt with the center's name printed on the back, noticed him hovering near the entrance and walked over with the straightforward friendliness of someone trained to welcome strangers. He asked if he was there for dinner or if he needed something specific. And the man who owned a house with 12 rooms and a security system that cost more per year than most people earned said, honestly, that he wasn't entirely sure why he was there, which made the young man smile and say that was fine. Most people figured it out eventually. Before he could say anything else, she turned and saw him. He had half expected her to look startled or nervous, or at least caught off guard in some way. But she didn't look any of those things. She looked at him the way you look at something you've been waiting for, with patience, not surprised, not relieved, just quietly acknowledging that the moment had arrived. She said his name the same way she always said it, with the same level tone she used to confirm which room she had cleaned or ask whether he wanted the windows left open. And then she said something that he would think about for a long time afterward. She said, simply, that he should come see the kitchen. So he followed her. Through the hall, past the tables and the noise and the smell of food, through a set of double doors that swung open into a kitchen that was nothing like the one in his house. His kitchen had been designed by an architect and featured in a magazine. All clean lines and imported stone. This one was a working kitchen in the truest sense. Every surface doing something, every shelf loaded. 3 volunteers moving around each other with the practiced ease of people who had done this together many times before. There was a woman at the stove who had to be in her 70s, stirring a pot with the slow confidence of someone who had never once burned anything by accident. There was a teenage girl chopping vegetables at a speed that suggested she had been doing it since she could hold a knife. There was a man near the back washing trays in the sink and humming to himself. And none of them stopped what they were doing when the two of them walked in. They just glanced over and nodded and kept going. She showed him everything without any performance, without any attempt to impress him or frame it in a way that would land well. She talked about the center the way you talk about something that is just a fact of your life. 200 families served every Thursday evening, she said. People from the surrounding neighborhood, many of them immigrants, many of them elderly, some of them going through hard stretches and needing a reliable meal and a room full of people to sit with for a few hours. The center had been running for 14 years. She had been volunteering there for 11 of them. Before she had ever worked in a private household, before she had ever taken the kind of job that required background checks and confidentiality agreements, she had been coming here every Thursday to help cook and serve and do whatever needed doing. She said it without pride and without modesty, in the same plain tone you'd use to explain how you take your coffee, and that more than anything was what made it hit so hard. He asked her why she had never mentioned it, and she looked at him for a moment before she answered, not defensively, just thinking about how to say what she meant precisely. She said that she was not in the habit of announcing the things she did with her own time, and that in her experience, when people found out about this kind of work, they either wanted to make it about themselves, or they got uncomfortable and started treating her differently, and she had no interest in either outcome. She was there to do her job at his house, and she was there to do this, and the two things had nothing to do with each other. He didn't know what to say to that, so he didn't say anything, which was unusual for him because he was a man who was very rarely without words. They walked back out into the main hall, and he stood there watching the room, watching the old man in the corner, being helped with his coat by one of the volunteers, watching the young mother with the sleeping baby on her shoulder, eating with one hand and scrolling through something on her phone with the other, watching a group of children near the window playing some hand-clapping game with total concentration. And the feeling that moved through him was not pity, and it was not admiration exactly. It was something quieter and more uncomfortable than either of those things. It was the feeling of realizing you had been looking at someone every day and had not seen them at all. He didn't leave right away. That was the thing he hadn't planned for. He had followed her, expecting to find something that would confirm his suspicion. Something that would justify the 3 weeks of quiet unease he had been carrying around like a stone in his pocket. And instead he found himself standing in a folding chair at the end of one of the long tables with a bowl of stew in front of him that a small girl with 2 braids had placed there with the serious, careful concentration of someone completing an important task. He hadn't asked for it. She had just appeared beside him, set the bowl down, looked at him once to make sure he had seen it, and walked away satisfied. He looked at the bowl for a moment, and then he picked up the spoon and he ate. And it was one of the best things he had tasted in a long time, which struck him as almost funny, given that he had a private chef who trained in Europe and cooked with ingredients, flown in twice a week. There was something in the food here that had nothing to do with technique and everything to do with intention. The way food tastes when it's been made by someone who is feeding people because they genuinely want those people to be fed. He sat there and he watched the room the way he hadn't let himself watch it when he first walked in. Really watched it, not with the scanning assessment he used in boardrooms or the careful social reading he did at events, but just openly, the way you watch something when you have no agenda and no position to protect. An elderly man 2 seats down was telling a long story to no one in particular, gesturing with his fork at intervals. And the young volunteer sitting across from him was listening with his whole body tilted forward, nodding at the right moments, in no hurry to be anywhere else. A woman near the window was helping a child with what looked like homework spread across one corner of the table, pointing at something on the page, and the child was chewing the end of a pencil and thinking hard. Near the serving table, two women who looked like they had known each other for decades were talking in low voices and laughing at something private. The kind of laugh that has years of shared history in it. Nobody in this room was performing anything for anyone. That was what kept striking him. He spent most of his life in rooms where everyone was performing something. Confidence, generosity, influence, humility, whatever the occasion required. And he had been doing it so long himself that he had almost forgotten what it looked like when people just existed without an audience. She moved through the room the whole time he sat there, and he watched how people responded to her. Not with the kind of deference people showed him, not with the slight tension that comes from being near someone who has power over your situation, but with something warmer and more genuine than that. The old man with the forked story reached out and touched her arm as she passed, and she paused, and bent down to listen to something he said. And whatever it was made her laugh again, with that same full, unguarded laugh he had seen earlier. A woman with a young baby on her hip stopped her, and they talked for a few minutes, and she touched the baby's cheek with the back of her finger the way people do when they are genuinely delighted by a child and not just going through the motions of it. A teenage boy who looked like he was working hard to seem unbothered by everything asked her something quietly, and she answered him seriously, without talking down to him, and he nodded and looked slightly less unbothered, which was clearly the point. She had a relationship with every single person in that room. Not a surface one, not the kind you build by showing up and being pleasant, but the deep kind, the kind that takes years of consistent presence to earn. 11 years, she had said. 11 years of every Thursday, in this room, in this apron, stirring this food, sitting with these people. He had rotated his household staff every 6 months because he believed continuity was a vulnerability. She had shown up to this cinderblock building every week for over a decade because she understood, in a way he clearly had not, that continuity was the whole point. At some moment during the evening, her head of volunteers, a broad-shouldered woman in her 50s with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and the energy of someone who had run things for a very long time, came over and sat across from him, without being asked and introduced. Herself the way people do when they're not intimidated by anyone, which he found he respected immediately. She told him, without any particular agenda, just as a matter of fact, that the woman he had come in with was the reason the center had stayed open during the 2 hardest years of its history. That there had been a period when the funding had collapsed and the lease was nearly up, and most of the regular volunteers had drifted away because life had gotten complicated for everyone. And she had been the one who kept showing up. She had reorganized the supply donations. She had found 2 new funding contacts through people she knew. She had, on at least 3 occasions, quietly covered the cost of groceries out of her own money when the weekly supplies ran short, and had told no one about it until someone found the receipts by accident months later. He sat with that for a moment. He thought about what she earned working in his house. He knew the number exactly because he had approved the staffing budget himself. It was a fair wage by the standard of the industry. He had always told himself that, but sitting in this room hearing this, the number felt different. It felt small in a way that was hard to look at directly. The woman with the reading glasses on her forehead wasn't saying any of this to make him feel a particular way. She was just telling him because he was there, and it was true. And she was clearly someone who said true things plainly. She got up after a while and went back to managing the room. And he sat there with his empty bowl and the particular kind of silence that settles over you when you've been handed information that rearranges something inside you, and you haven't quite finished rearranging yet. His head of security had come inside at some point and was sitting near the door with a cup of tea that someone had apparently brought him, looking entirely unbothered, and when their eyes met across the room, he gave a small, neutral expression that communicated nothing except that he was fine and in no hurry. Later, when it was close to the end of the evening and the tables were being cleared and the children were sleepy and the room was slowly emptying, she came and stood near him again, not in a pointed way, just naturally. The way you come to stand near someone when the event is winding down. He asked her how the center was funded, and she told him, a patchwork of small grants. A few private donors, fundraisers that brought in enough to get through the next few months. Always just far enough ahead to keep going, but never enough to feel secure. He asked what the biggest practical needs were. The things that would make the most difference, not in a grand sense, but in a daily, operational sense. And she thought about it seriously before she answered, which he noticed. Because most people, when asked that question by someone like him, immediately reached for the biggest number they could justify. She didn't do that. She mentioned the roof, which had 2 places where it leaked badly when it rained hard, and the main stove, which was running on 1 functional burner and had been for 4 months, and enough dry goods stocked in advance that the volunteers weren't anxious every week about whether supplies would show up in time. 3 things. Practical, specific, honest. He nodded and didn't say anything immediately, and she didn't push. She just accepted the nod and went back to helping clear the tables. And he sat there another few minutes in the quieting room, listening to the last of the piano notes drifting through from the side room, thinking about all the people he had suspected and monitored and let go over the years in the name of protecting himself, and wondering, not for the first time that evening and not for the last, exactly what it was he thought he had been protecting. He didn't sleep that night. Not in the restless, turning kind of way where your body is tired but your mind won't settle, but in a more deliberate way, the kind where you're not really trying to sleep because some part of you knows there's something you need to sit with first, and sleep would just be a way of avoiding it. He got home, dismissed the driver, walked past the kitchen where his private chef had left a covered plate for him in the refrigerator as usual, and went and sat in the chair by the window in his study that looked out over the valley. The one he never actually sat in because he was usually at his desk or on a call or moving through the house toward the next thing. He sat in it properly this time, both feet on the floor, no phone in his hand. And he looked out at the lights spread across the dark valley below, and he thought. The first thing he thought about was the application. He had a system for hiring household staff that he had believed was thorough: agency vetting, reference checks, background reviews, an in-person assessment by his head of security. But he had never once personally read any of the applications that came through, because that was what the system was for. That was what other people were paid to handle. And he had always told himself that delegating was a sign of efficient leadership and not a way of staying comfortably distant from the details that might complicate his certainty. He went to his desk and pulled up the staffing files on his computer, and he found her application, and he read it from the beginning, slowly, the way he hadn't read anything in a long time, because he was used to summaries and bullet points and other people's conclusions. It was a straightforward document. Clean work history, clear references, honest about the gaps in employment that had come during a period when she had been caring for a sick relative back home. And there, near the bottom, under a section that asked for additional experience and skills, in plain unformatted text that someone had clearly just typed without trying to make it impressive, were the words "Community Volunteer Work, East Palo Alto, 11 years. He stared at that line for a while. It had been there the whole time, right there in a document that existed in his own system, in a file with her name on it, accessible to him at any point over the past 3 weeks during which he had been quietly building a case of suspicion out of nothing more than the fact that she was private and consistent and left 17 minutes early on Thursdays. He had the information, and he had chosen, without even realizing he was choosing, not to look at it. That was the part that stayed with him longest that night. Not the embarrassment of having followed her, not even the guilt of having suspected her without cause, but the specific realization that the truth had been available to him the whole time, and his assumptions had made it invisible. He thought about his head of security then, about what he had said in the car on the way home. That he had known about the community center for 2 weeks. That he hadn't mentioned it because he wasn't sure it was his place. And because he had wanted to see what his employer would do when he found out on his own. He had been quietly stung by that in the car, but sitting with it now, he understood it differently. The man had worked for him for over a decade. He knew better than almost anyone the patterns of how this household operated. The suspicion that rotated staff every 6 months, the cameras, the logs, the background checks repeated on people who had already been checked. And at some point over those 10 years, he had clearly made peace with all of it, because that was the job, and it was a good job, and he was a professional. But he had also clearly been watching. And what he had seen in those 2 weeks, and what he had chosen to withhold until his employer found his own way to the truth, said something about the limits of loyalty when loyalty requires you to keep feeding a machine you privately think has gone wrong. He didn't feel angry about it. He felt something closer to grateful, which surprised him. He went back to the window and sat down again. He thought about the woman with the reading glasses on her forehead at the community center. The one who had sat across from him and told him, matter-of-factly, about the groceries paid for out of pocket. About the 2 years when everything nearly fell apart and one person's consistency had held it together. He thought about the receipts found by accident, the quiet covering of costs that had never been announced or used as leverage or brought up in any conversation. He thought about what it meant to do something like that, to spend your own limited money on a problem that was not technically yours to solve. To tell nobody, to simply do it and move on and keep showing up the next week and the week after. He had donated millions to causes over the years. He knew the number precisely because his foundation director sent quarterly summaries and the year-end totals were part of how he measured his own impact. He had always felt, on some level, that the scale of it meant something, that giving at that level was a different and more serious thing than what ordinary people did when they dropped money in a collection box or volunteered on a weekend. Sitting in the dark, now he wasn't sure that calculation held up the way he had always assumed it did. There was something in what she had done, the smallness of the amount, the privateness of it, the complete absence of any desire for it to be known, that felt more serious to him right now than any of the gala donations he had ever made with his name attached. He thought about the 6-month rotation policy and what it was actually for. He had always framed it to himself and to others as a security measure, a sensible precaution for a man in his position, which was true as far as it went. But sitting with it honestly, now he could see the other thing underneath it. The thing the framing had always been there to cover. It was fear. Plain, unadorned fear. Not a theft or espionage, not really, because the security systems handled those risks more effectively than any rotation policy ever could. It was the fear of letting people get close enough to see you clearly. Because if they saw you clearly, they might find something disappointing. Or they might leave anyway. Or they might stay and use what they knew in ways you couldn't control. It was the same fear that had made him stop reading applications and start reading security logs. The same fear that had sent him down a dark street in the rain following a woman who had done nothing wrong. Because his gut could no longer tell the difference between a real threat and a person who was simply living a life that had nothing to do with him. His therapist had told him this more than once in various ways. He had always nodded and said he understood, and then gone home and checked the security logs before bed. Understanding something and actually changing because of it were 2 different countries, and he had been standing at the border of that particular crossing for a long time without going through. He got up at some point around 2 in the morning and walked down to the kitchen and stood in it for a while. The imported stone, the architect-designed layout, the covered plate in the refrigerator made by someone paid to anticipate his hunger. And he thought about the kitchen he had been in earlier that evening. The one with the one working burner and the woman in her 70s who had never burned anything by accident. And the teenage girl with the knife who had learned to cook early because someone had thought it was worth teaching her. He wasn't hungry anymore, but he stood there a while longer because sometimes you need to stand somewhere and let the comparison be uncomfortable instead of reaching immediately for something to make it less so. He made a decision sometime before 3 in the morning, not with drama, not with the kind of grand internal declaration that people describe in memoirs, but quietly, the way real decisions are usually made, with a kind of tired clarity that comes when you have finally finished arguing with yourself, and the argument has settled into something simple. He picked up his phone and sent a short message to his foundation director that said he needed an address. Checked first thing in the morning, and a conversation about moving quickly on something. No public announcement, no naming rights, no event. Just the work. He put the phone down. He went to bed. And for the first time in a long time, he slept.